We're live both on YouTube and on TikTok. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the King James Version of the Bible, and particularly how it is inaccurate. The King James Version is actually the most inaccurate version of the Bible on the market right now. And which is an interesting thing to most people because a lot of people think that because the King James Version is closer in time to the uh, to right now, right? That since the King James Version is I'm sorry, closer in time to when the events in the Bible happened, people often think that that means that the King James Version is more accurate. But it actually means the opposite, oddly enough, because what's happened since the King James Version was translated is we have discovered archaeologically many more fragments and passages from the Bible and full books of the Bible that are older, right? So the King James Version, it's based on a younger collection of manuscripts. So we know a lot more about what was closer to the original text. We don't have anything that was like written by Moses or written by Paul, like in their hand. We don't have anything like that. But what we do have is a lot of really old manuscripts that especially in the New Testament get pretty close to the time they were first being written. And by pretty close, I mean, a century or two. Um, but the King James Version didn't have the benefit of all of those. The King James Version is based on a lot younger collection of texts. So we have a lot older collection of texts. And that's why the King James Version actually has a number of different passages that just aren't in the Bible, and this is how we know. So basically, if you take the over here, if you take the earliest version of, like, I don't know, let's just say the book of Mark. Okay, so you've got the earliest version of the book of Mark right here that we've discovered, and then we have one that's a little bit younger, and a little bit younger, and a little bit younger, a little bit younger, and a little bit younger, right? And we can actually track changes along the path from the oldest to the youngest, and that is important because what you can see as you get older and older is that you'll see, oh, wait a second, at this point, something was added. It's in everything after this point, but it's in nothing before that point. And actually, Mark is a really great example of that. If you go to the end of the book of Mark, at the end of the book of Mark, you have a large section called the long ending to the book of Mark. That section is the part where it talks about holding snakes and drinking poison. That was not in the original text. Scholars are very confident in saying that's actually wasn't in the original book of Mark, because what we see is that, like, here's this oldest version. It's not there. It's not there. It's not there. That ending of the book is not there. And then all of a sudden it appears here, and then it's in everything afterwards. So you can see that this has been added to the text right here. The problem is the King James Version didn't have the benefit of all of these texts. These older texts, had not yet been discovered. And so there's a number of verses that exist in the King James Bible and nowhere else. And there's large passages like that part of the book of Mark. If you go to that, just go right to the back, the end of the book of Mark, you'll see, if it's a modern translation, not a King James translation, you'll see that there's a brackets, or it's grayed out, or there's an asterisk, and it says it's not in the oldest manuscripts. There are also many verses in the New Testament that don't even appear right? That scholars are so confident. Like there's one that they see it written in by hand and then included normally in the ones later, right? And those you'll see like John chapter 8. It'll be like verse 16, 17, 18, and then 20. And then you ask, where is verse 19? Well, it's been taken out by scholars because it wasn't in the original version. And the King James is rife with that. It's got a lot of really of huge problems just because we have much older manuscripts. We have a much better understanding of what was in the original text, or what is more likely to be in the original text, because we don't have those, right? The other thing about the King James Bible that's pretty interesting is it's actually a revision of something called the Bishop's Bible. So at the time the King James Bible was released, the most popular Bible at the time was something called the Bishop's Bible. But King James didn't like that for a number of reasons. He wanted a Bible that was that used the terms, the English terms for like things like bishops and churches, the way that they talked about it in the Anglican Church. He wanted his Bible to use those terms, and he also wanted it not to be so anti-monarchy and a number of different things like that. And so he told his translators, the translators that were going to create the King James Version, okay, I need you to go in and these are some translation values that I want you to have when you are translating the text. And they did. But what's interesting is a lot of the King James is just a direct copy of that Bishop's Bible, really word for word. But they did have access to Greek and Hebrew, and they used that. And they used that in a really weird way. So if you're familiar with other languages, right, you might know that that like in Spanish, it's like, this is my house in English, right? But in Spanish, this is the house of me, right? The my house in English is my is first, but in Spanish, the my is last, right? And so you could translate it in that order, the Spanish, say like, this is the house of me. But that's not how we speak in modern English. We would say, this is my house. So what's interesting about the King James Version is that in a lot of this is actually done like that, where they will take the syntax of the Hebrew or the Greek, the order of the words and that kind of stuff, and then they will map the English translation, the English words, onto that syntax, which makes it really confusing. In fact, one of the funniest things, like, a modern complaint of people about the King James Version is it's hard to understand, right? But people will say, well, it's old. It's the way that they used to talk. It's the way that they talked when it first came out. But that's not true. When the King James Version first came out, it was widely panned for not being able to be easily understood because people didn't talk that way. That's what they would say, like, no one talks like this Bible. And as a result, the King James Bible was not popular when it came out. It wasn't until King James banned the Bishop's Bible, which was the most popular translation, that the King James Version rose in popularity. But when we talk about inaccuracy, so there's that syntax inaccuracy. We've got the inaccuracy that we talked about just a minute ago, in that we have much older copies of the text now. We have access to older copies now than they did then because of archaeology and discovery. And so we know there's a problem of inaccuracy, that there are things that they just weren't in the original version that are in the King James. And they just didn't know, right? That was their best. It was the best that they had at the time. But then there are problems with the way the English language has progressed. So let's look at a classic example of this comes from the book of Jude. Jude is in the New Testament. It only has one chapter, so you don't have chapter and verse. It's just Jude 22. It's verse 22 of Jude. And it says, but of some have compassion, making a difference. So when we hear that phrase, to make a difference, in our modern usage, that colloquialism, right, that idiom is to make a difference is like to have a positive impact on the world, right? I'm going to go and work on a habitat house. I'm going to make a difference in my community. That's how we use that word, make a difference. And so when you read that in the King James Version, you will read it with your modern meaning of phrases. That's just the way it works when we read. But the problem is that the word make a difference doesn't mean the same thing today as it did then. During that time, when the King James Version was being translated, when the King James Version was being translated, make a difference meant to make a distinction, right? Like I'm trying to make a difference between evangelical Christians and progressive Christians. I'm trying to make a distinction, right? So the King James Version will say right here, but if some have compassion, but on some have compassion, making a difference. And so, that this idea of making a difference, as in like having a positive impact, that meaning was not on that word until the 1800s, right? So in the King James Version, it would mean, but on some have compassion, but be discerning on who you should have compassion on, right? But so that's just that one phrase in that one verse, but that verse also has another complication because that verse is based on outdated manuscripts, right? We have a lot better manuscripts, older manuscripts that make a little bit of change. The object of the word compassion, like the way that the Greek word is just slightly wrong, and the object of the word compassion is different, and so really it's those who are making a difference. So the idea is have compassion on basically on people who are trying, who have doubts, who have questions, right? So so if you read it in the other way, have compassion, not have compassion on people, but be discerning as to who, but have compassion on those people who are doubting, right? That's a huge difference. And the difference comes in that one from a sort of a double whammy. One, the English has changed, and two, though we have older manuscripts that make it more accurate. And so the King James Version is just not accurate. And that's an important thing to note. Now, we are going to spend some time. I'm going to spend some time asking or answering questions. If you have a question of me, I'd love for you to go ahead and put that in the chat. We're both on YouTube and on TikTok tonight. So go ahead and put your question in the chat. I'm going to be looking at the chat on YouTube and on TikTok to try to keep up with those questions. And we'll do some questions and answers for a little while. So go ahead and put those questions in. We've been talking about the King James Version. You can have a question about anything, anything you like. Just stick that in the chat on Instagram or TikTok, and I will start answering those as they come in. And I'm actually going to type that here. Go ahead, put your questions in the chat. So yeah. Oh, great. Chelsea Duke. What's my view on modern day tithing? Man, that is a loaded question, and I have all kinds of opinions about that. We're gonna get to that right now. So here's the thing: tithing is not in the Bible. And by that I mean the idea that you need to give 10% to the church is not in the Bible. The word tithe is in the Bible, but the biblical standard for tithing is 10% twice and an additional 2.5%. So it's really 22.5%. And that's if you're going to sort of assess people for money based on the biblical standard, is 22.5%. And no pastor in their right mind would ever ask their congregation to give 22.5%. And so the other thing, though, to remember is that when we're talking about tithing during the time of the Bible, we're talking about a time when the Bible was biblical cultures were. I'm sorry. We're talking about a time when biblical cultures, the biblical culture was a combination of the religion and the politics. They were a theocracy. And so when you talk about giving to the church at that point, giving to the church at that point was also handling things that the government handles as well. So it's just not a good one-to-one. And the other thing is the idea that you would take something that was culturally defined 3,000 years ago and try to bring it up one-to-one to the modern day is just a bad idea. In addition, so the other thing that's really interesting to me about the whole tithing thing is that it's often held up 10%, which again is not in the Bible, is held up as like a bare minimum. If you're going to be faithful to God, you have to give 10% of your income. But that's just not there. And what it does is it makes people feel guilty when they can't give 10%, or it makes people who can't afford to give 10%, people who can't afford to give 10%, they might sacrifice, and they end up I've heard so many stories of people sacrificing food, clothing for their children so that they give the 10% to the church so that they are being faithful to God in their finances, when the Bible just doesn't say that. That is not a core teaching of Christianity. So yeah, that's what I think. Chelsea, Bridget, you say you've heard Mormon pastors expect that much. Yeah, it's awful. And look, I'm not saying that you shouldn't give to a church. I think there are lots of churches are nonprofits, and there's a lot of great nonprofits in America, in the United States of America. They're nonprofits. There's a lot of great nonprofits. Nonprofits are generally responsible for all kinds of social good. You should donate to them, especially if you are participating in their work or you believe in their work. So you should definitely donate to a church. But you shouldn't think that donation at all, or 10% of your income is somehow required by God or required by the Bible. Is just not. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put those questions in the chat. I am answering as many of those as I can. So you can do that. Just stick those in the chat, and we'll get to those.